For more than 2,000 years, one of the greatest builders who ever lived has been remembered, when he has been remembered at all, as a monster, as a cruel and hated tyrant who enslaved a whole nation, who shut the temples and silenced the worship of his people, who cared nothing for the misery he caused and thought only of raising a mountain of stone to his own glory. This is the reputation that has clung to the ancient Egyptian king we call Khafre, the builder of the second great pyramid of Giza, for longer than most whole civilizations have existed. It is written down in one of the oldest history books in all the world. It has been repeated, in one form or another, for 100 generations. And tonight, across the long and quiet hours ahead, we are going to put it to the test. Because when you set that dark reputation beside the evidence, beside the actual stones and bones, and records that the earth has slowly given up, something strange begins to happen. The tyrant begins to dissolve. The charge is an old one, older than almost any other written about any single human being. It comes in its most famous form from a Greek traveler named Herodotus, a curious and tireless collector of stories who journeyed through Egypt some 2,000 years after Khafre had already died, and who wrote down what the local guides and priests told him about the distant past. And what they told him, or at least what he understood them to say, was a tale of horror. That the builders of the Great Pyramids, the King Cheops, whom we now call Khufu, and his brother Khafre, whom we now call Khafre, had been the cruelest rulers that Egypt ever suffered. That they had closed the temples and stopped the offerings to the powers the people revered, and driven the whole nation into slavery to raise their tombs, and that the people had hated them so bitterly that, even 100 generations later, they could scarcely bring themselves to speak their names aloud. It is a powerful and a terrible story, and for 2,000 years it was very nearly all that the world remembered of Khafre. And yet, stand before the statues that Khafre left behind him, the calm-seated figures carved in dark and gleaming stone, and look closely into that face. It is not the face of a monster. It is serene, level, composed, the face of a man in perfect command of himself and of his world, with the great falcon of the power they called Horus folded protectively about the back of his head. It is one of the most peaceful faces in all of ancient art, and that is the very first small crack in the story, because the Khafre of the monuments and the Khafre of the legend do not match. The one is calm, the other is cruel. The one built with a care and a genius that still stops the modern mind. The other is said to have destroyed and enslaved and oppressed. They cannot both be the truth. And so we are left with a question, a genuine and deeply fascinating question that will guide us through this entire long night. Who was the real Khafre? The tyrant of the story, or someone the story has wronged? This is what we are going to do together tonight. We are going to hold a kind of quiet trial, across the slow and darkening hours, with all the patience that so old a question deserves. First, we will hear the accusation in full, exactly as the ancient writers made it, in all of its dark and dramatic detail, and we will try to understand why it was made, and where it came from, and why it took the shape that it did. And then, one by one, we will call the witnesses for the defense. We will look at what the archaeologists have actually found in the sand at Giza, at the town where the pyramid builders truly lived, at the bones lying in their graves, at the records they left behind, at the temples and the statues and the tombs. We will weigh the legend against the evidence, charge by charge, and we will see which of the two is left standing at the end. It is a detective story, in its way, 4,500 years old, and the mystery at its very heart is the character of a single man. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand not only who Khafre most likely really was, but something deeper and stranger than that, something about how history itself is made, and unmade, and remade. You are going to understand how a great king can be slowly turned into a monster by nothing more than the passage of time and the whispers of folk memory. You are going to understand why the pyramids, those magnificent and astonishing achievements, came in later ages to be seen as symbols of cruelty and oppression. You are going to understand how a story told by a foreign traveler, 2,000 years after the fact, could bury the truth about a man so completely that it would take the patient work of modern science to dig him back out of the sand. And you are going to understand why the real story, the true story, is not only gentler than the legend, but very much more impressive. There is a subtlety here, and we will not shy away from it, for the truth is almost always more interesting than a simple reversal. This is not a story in which the wicked tyrant is revealed, at the end, to have been a perfect and gentle man. The building of the pyramids was, in its own way, one of the most enormous demands that any ruler has ever placed upon a people, an almost unimaginable concentration of labor and wealth and human effort, all of it pointed at a single tomb. There is a real weight of history behind the legend, a genuine memory of a whole nation bent to a colossal task. But between that and the tale of whips and slaves and shuttered temples, there lies a very great distance indeed. The legend took something real and twisted it into something false, and our work tonight is to gently untwist it and to see what was truly there all along. Consider just one small thing to carry with you as we set out, a first faint hint of what the evidence will show. In the legend, the men who built the pyramids were slaves, driven under the whip until they dropped, their broken bodies thrown aside. But when archaeologists in our own time at last found the actual town where the pyramid builders had lived, and the cemetery where they were buried, they found something that the legend could never have predicted. They found that these workers had been fed well, on bread and beer and the meat of cattle and sheep. They found that when their bones were broken by the heavy labor, someone had carefully set them and tended them and let them heal. They found workers buried with dignity, in tombs of their own, close to the very king they had served, their names and their trades recorded with a kind of quiet pride. This is not what a slave camp leaves behind in the earth, and it is one of the many quiet ways in which the ground, once we finally thought to ask it, has told a very different story from the one the traveler wrote down. We will return to that town and to those graves and to a great deal else besides in the long hours ahead, and we will examine them all closely. But even this single glimpse is enough to show that the legend and the evidence are pulling hard in opposite directions. And when a story and the solid ground beneath it disagree with one another so sharply as this, it is very nearly always the story that turns out to be in the wrong. Before we begin, if you find ancient Egypt as fascinating as we do, take a moment to like the video or subscribe. It's a small thing, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. So let us go back, first of all, not yet to Khafre's own distant time, but to the world of the man who accused him, to a Greek traveler standing among the ruins and the temples of an Egypt that was already unimaginably ancient, listening to the tales of the priests, and beginning to write down the story of the tyrant kings. And then let us travel further back still, across 2,000 more years, into the real world of Khafre himself, and begin, slowly and patient, to test the story against the stone. There is a great deal for us to weigh tonight, and we will take it gently and without the slightest hurry. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. Before we can weigh the charge against him, we must first know, at least a little, who the accused actually was. Khafre was a king of ancient Egypt, and he lived a very long time ago, some 4,500 years before our own day, in the great age we now call the Old Kingdom. In the line of rulers we number as the 4th dynasty. He was a son of the king Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, that largest of all the pyramids, and when his own turn came, Khafre built the second of the 3 great pyramids that still stand together upon the plateau of Giza. Most scholars believe that he also gave the world the Great Sphinx, that vast lion with a human face which crouches below his pyramid, gazing out forever toward the rising sun. He ruled, as far as the evidence can tell us, for something on the order of 24 to 26 years, an age of confidence and wealth and extraordinary building. Those are the bare bones of the man, a king, a son of a famous father, a builder of some of the most enduring things that human beings have ever made. Nothing at all in that plain account suggests a monster. The monster comes only from the stories. And to understand the stories, we must first understand the strange and enormous gulf of time across which they reach back to him. For Khafre belonged to a moment unlike any other in the long history of Egypt, or indeed of the whole world. His was the great age of the pyramid builders, a span of only a few generations in which the kings of Egypt raised, one after another, the largest stone structures that would ever be built anywhere on earth until the modern age. His grandfather Sneferu had learned through patient trial and correction how to raise a true and smooth-sided pyramid. His father Khufu had used that hard-won knowledge to build the Great Pyramid, a mountain of more than 2 million blocks of stone, and Khafre in his own turn built beside it, almost as vast. To live in that age, upon that plateau, was to live inside the single greatest building project the world had ever seen, a project that swallowed up the labor and the wealth of an entire nation, year after year, for generation upon generation. This is the world that would one day be remembered, dimly and darkly, as an age of suffering, and we should not be at all surprised that it would be. for such an effort must have reached into the life of very nearly every family in the land. To understand why a whole people would pour such effort into a single tomb, we have to remember, again, what a king truly was in the belief of the ancient Egyptians. He was not a ruler as we would think of one today. He stood, in their understanding of the world, at the very center of all things, the living embodiment of the power they revered as Horus, the one who kept the great balance of the world, which they called Mat, in its place against the ever-pressing dark. To build his tomb, and to secure his passage into the life beyond that they believed in, was, in their eyes, not merely to honor a man, but to keep the whole ordered world from falling into chaos. And so the nation gave its strength to the task. But here, already, we can begin to see how a much later age, looking back across the centuries, might read that enormous shared effort not as devotion at all, but as oppression, not as a people freely bending to a sacred duty, but as a people driven and broken and enslaved. The very same facts, seen through different eyes, across a gulf of 2,000 years, can come to wear an entirely different face. And that gulf of 2,000 years is the true heart of our whole problem tonight. For here is a thing that surprises a great many people when they first learn it. From Khafre's own age, we have almost no written account of the man himself. His people did not write biographies of their kings. They did not set down his words, his decisions, his character, his private life, his joys, or his fears. What they left behind were monuments and inscriptions of royal titles and offerings, and the silent evidence of tombs and statues in stone. Of the inner Khafre, the living person, his own time is very nearly silent. And into a silence like that one, over the long, slow centuries, other things come flooding in. Memory shifts and softens and darkens, stories grow, legends form, and harden, and are handed down, and after enough time has passed, no one can any longer tell the difference between what truly happened and what was merely told. By the time anyone thought to write down a full and connected story of the Pyramid Kings, 2,000 whole years had passed since they had lived and died. That is a span of time as great as the one that separates us today from the very height of ancient Rome. Imagine trying to recover the true character of a ruler who lived 2,000 years before you, from nothing but the tales that the local guides still tell. That is precisely the task which produced the legend of the tyrant Khafre. The man who wrote that legend down, in the form that has echoed on through all the ages since, was the Greek traveler Herodotus. He is often called the father of history, for he was among the very first to try to gather up the stories of the past and of the wider world, and set them down in a single ordered account. He lived some 2,000 years after Khafre, and about 2,500 years before our own time, and he traveled widely across the known world, and came at last to Egypt, which even then was a place of almost unimaginable antiquity, its great age already the stuff of wonder and legend. And in Egypt he did just what a curious traveler does. He looked, and he listened, and he asked his questions, and he wrote down the answers he was given. He spoke, it seems, with priests and with guides, most likely through interpreters, for he did not himself know the Egyptian tongue. And he carefully recorded what they told him about the builders of the great pyramids. Now Herodotus was a sharp and honest observer of a great deal that he saw with his own eyes. But he was also a gatherer of tales, and he passed on many stories that we now know for certain to be mistaken, or garbled, or simply impossible. He himself would sometimes note that he was only reporting what he had been told, and did not necessarily believe it to be true. And the story of the tyrant pyramid builders was one of exactly these, a tale received at second or third hand, across a gulf of 20 centuries, set down in good faith perhaps, but very far indeed from solid and certain history. And what a tale it was. In the account that Herodotus set down, a good and just king had once ruled Egypt in peace and prosperity, and then Khufu came to the throne and plunged the whole land into misery. He closed the temples, the story went, and forbade the people their worship and their offerings to the powers they held sacred, and set the entire nation to labor upon his pyramid, in vast gangs of tens of thousands of men, toiling in shifts for decade after decade. And when Khufu at last died, his brother Khafre took the throne and behaved, so the tale claimed, in exactly the same cruel manner, so that between the two of them the temples stood shut, and the people suffered for more than 100 years together. And the people came to hate these two kings so very deeply, the story ended, that they would not even speak their names, and called the great pyramids instead, after a humble shepherd, who had once grazed his flocks upon that same plateau. It is a story with a very clear and satisfying shape, the shape of a moral fable, of pride and cruelty at last punished by the hatred of all the ages that followed. And that neat, satisfying shape is itself one of the very first reasons that we ought to be cautious of it. For real history is only very rarely so tidy as that. Herodotus was not the only voice in this ancient chorus. Others took up the same dark theme after him. Centuries later, an Egyptian priest named Manetho, who wrote a history of his own land, described the builder of the Great Pyramid as a man who had grown arrogant and contemptuous toward the powers his people revered, echoing that same charge of impiety and neglect. And later still, another Greek writer named Diodorus repeated the old tales of forced labor and of slavery. But here we come upon our first real hint that even the ancients themselves did not fully trust these stories. For Diodorus, unlike Herodotus, openly doubted them. He remarked that the Egyptians of his own day could not actually say, with any certainty at all, who had truly built the pyramids, and he even put forward quite different kings as the possible builders. He dismissed some of what the earlier writers had claimed as little more than entertaining fiction. So even within the ancient tradition itself, the story of the tyrant kings was never settled fact. It was contested and uncertain, a matter of competing and half-remembered tales, already crumbling at its edges 2,000 years ago. To judge how much weight the story of the tyrant Khafre can truly bear, it helps a great deal to know what else Herodotus was willing to write down as he traveled. For alongside his sober and careful observations, he also passed on some wonderfully strange things. He reported that in a far-off eastern land there lived giant ants, larger than foxes, that dug up gold from the sand as they burrowed. He wrote of winged serpents that flew out of Arabia. He described the phoenix, the marvelous bird that was said to burn itself upon a fire and be reborn from its own ashes. He passed on curious tales of the hidden sources of the Nile, and of distant peoples with fantastical customs at the edges of the world. Now, some of these wonders he doubted openly and said so. Others he set down quite plainly, as though they were simple fact. The point is not that Herodotus was a fool, for he was nothing of the kind. He was a genuine pioneer and a sharp observer of a great deal that he saw. The point is only that his pages mingle solid fact with wonder and rumor, all bound up together, and that the reader must always be asking which is which. And his tale of the pyramid tyrants sits squarely in the doubtful half, a story of the deep past, received at third hand, about events 2,000 years gone before he ever heard them. We would not build our picture of the natural world upon his gold-digging ants. We should be every bit as careful before we build our picture of a king's very soul upon his pyramid tales. And yet we should not simply throw Herodotus away, for that would be its own kind of error, and a lazy one, where he described what he saw with his own two eyes, the customs of the Egyptians of his day, the look and the smell of the land, the careful practice of mummifications, the sacred animals, the small details of daily life along the river. He is often strikingly accurate, confirmed again and again by what archaeology has since dug out of the ground. He was a real and a valuable witness to the Egypt of his own time. The trouble comes only when he reaches far back, beyond all living memory, into the deep past, and repeats to us what he was told about kings who had died 2,000 years before he was even born. There he is no longer truly a witness at all, but a recorder of legends. And so our task with him is not to dismiss him, but to weigh him with care, to separate the traveler who genuinely saw from the storyteller who was merely told. And on the Pyramid Kings, he is the storyteller. The story that he tells us must therefore be tested against harder things than words. What, then, do we actually possess from Khafre's own time, against which we might test the tale? The Egyptians did keep some records of their own. There survive fragments of ancient royal annals, carved long ago into stone, such as the broken slab we now call the Palermo stone, which lists the early kings and the years of their reigns, and notes certain events, the great offerings made, the height of the annual flood, year by year. There are the king lists that were compiled in later ages, setting the rulers in their long order. There are the tombs of the officials, inscribed with their titles and the careers they were proud of. But nowhere in all of this is there any portrait of Khafre's character, any account at all of whether he was cruel or kind, whether he was loved or hated by his people. His own countrymen simply did not write their history in that way. They recorded the eternal, the ritual, the ordered and unchanging surface of things, and not the private truth of a single king's heart. And so, upon the very question that the legend so boldly claims to answer, whether Khafre was in truth a monster, his own age is entirely silent. The legend does not fill some small and narrow gap in the record. It comes flooding into a vast and echoing emptiness, and that alone should make us cautious, for a story that rushes in to fill a silence is very often telling us far more about the people who tell it than about the man it claims to describe. And there is a further oddity in the legend, one that we can already begin to feel. Even before we reach the physical evidence at all, the story insists, over and over, that the people hated these kings so very bitterly that they would not even speak their names aloud. And yet the record of Egypt itself tells us something quite different. Khafre's funerary cult, the priests and the offerings that served and sustained his memory, appears to have continued for generations and perhaps for centuries after his death, maintained and honored in the ordinary and expected way. His statues were carefully preserved. His great monuments stood and were held in awe. Later kings, in ages long after his own, came to the Giza Plateau and treated its pyramids and its sphinx not as monuments of shame at all, but as objects of reverence and wonder, precious links to a golden past that even they could scarcely imagine. If Khafre had truly been a hated tyrant whose very name his people longed to erase, this is a most strange way for his memory to have been treated across the long centuries that followed. The deep reverence of the later Egyptians for the works of Khafre sits very awkwardly indeed against the tale of universal loathing. And that awkwardness is another loose thread hanging from the legend, one that we will take up and pull upon, gently, before this night is through. We might pause, too, upon the sheer flavor of some of the details in the tale, for it tells us much about what kind of thing the tale really is. Herodotus reported, for instance, that Khufu, grown desperate for money to fund his endless building, had sent his own daughter to sell her body, and that she had asked each of her visitors to give her also a single block of stone, from which, the story claimed, a small pyramid was afterward built. It is exactly the kind of lurid and memorable and faintly ridiculous detail in which folk tales the world over delight, a wandering motif of the wicked king and the sacrificed daughter, of a sort found in the legends of many lands and many ages. It bears every single mark of pure invention, of a story shaped and polished for its shock and its moral lesson, rather than for anything resembling the truth. And when a tale carries within it elements as transparently legendary as this one, it casts a long, cold shadow of doubt back over the whole of the rest of it. If a piece as central as this is plainly folklore, then we are surely right to wonder just how much of the entire grim portrait is folklore too. There is one more piece of Khafre's world that we must set carefully in place before the trial itself can begin, and it concerns the way in which the great works were actually organized and manned. For the Egyptian state of the Old Kingdom had learned to do something genuinely extraordinary. It had learned to gather up the surplus of an entire nation, the spare food and the spare time and the spare strength of millions of people, and to point all of it together at a single chosen purpose. During the long season of the flood, when the fields lay drowned beneath a risen river and the farmers simply could not work their land, the state could call upon that idle labor within a system of duty that was owed, in their belief, to the king himself. The workers were gathered into organized gangs, they were housed, and they were fed from the royal storehouses. This was a demand upon the people, to be sure, and a heavy one. But it was a demand of a very particular kind, seasonal, organized, provisioned, woven neatly into the natural rhythm of the farming year, and bound up at every turn with the deep belief in a sacred duty owed to the living embodiment of the power they revered as Horus. Whether such a system ought to be called oppression, or devotion, or simply the way that whole world worked, is itself one of the very questions that our trial must weigh. But it is already a very long way indeed from the image of chained and starving slaves laboring under the crack of the whip. Hold that distinction close as we go, for a great deal will turn upon it. So how, then, shall we proceed across the long and quiet hours that lie ahead of us? We shall do what any honest inquiry into the distant past must do. We shall hold the old tales in one hand, and the hard physical evidence in the other, and we shall let the evidence lead the way. Where the stones and the bones and the records of Khafre's own age agree with the legend, we shall grant legend its full due, and say so plainly. Where they flatly contradict it, we shall trust the silent witnesses of the earth over the whispered tales of guides 2,000 years removed from the events. And where neither the one nor the other can settle the matter, we shall say as much honestly and leave the question standing open, for that too is a part of telling the truth about the past. This is not a trial whose verdict has been quietly decided in advance. It is a genuine and careful weighing of the evidence. And what makes it so absorbing, so worth the sitting up through the night for, is that on charge after charge after charge, the evidence turns out to have a very great deal to say. So this, then, is the accusation, and these are the accusers. A mere handful of writers reaching back across an almost unimaginable gulf of time, repeating stories they had gathered from guides and priests, stories already old and worn and garbled by the time that they wrote them down. It is not nothing, and we will treat it with respect. A tradition this old and this persistent must surely have grown from some real root, and part of our work tonight will be to find that root and to understand what truth, if any, lies buried deep within the legend. But a tradition of tales is not at all the same thing as evidence, and we are fortunate, for we possess something that the ancient writers themselves did not, something that can speak to us directly out of Khafre's own age, without the distortions of 2,000 years of retelling laid thickly over the top of it. We possess the stones, we possess the bones, we possess the very things that the pyramid builders themselves left behind them, there in the ground, and it is to those silent and patient and truthful witnesses that we now turn, to begin the real work of testing the legend against the world. Let us go down, then, into the evidence, and put the tyrant on trial. Let us begin, as any fair trial must, by hearing the case against the accused in full, in all of its dark and dramatic detail, before we say a single word in his defense. We must not soften it, or hurry past it. If we are to test the legend honestly, we must first let it speak with its full and terrible force. So listen now to the story exactly as the ancient world told it, the story of the tyrant brothers of Giza, and feel the weight of the charge. In the tale that Herodotus set down, Egypt had once been a happy and a well-ruled land. A good king had reigned before, and, under him, the story said, there had been nothing but orderly rule, and the land had prospered greatly. The people worshipped freely, the temples stood open, the river rose and fell, and the harvests came in, and all was as it should be. And then that golden time ended, and the darkness fell. For then, the tale continued, Khufu came to the throne, and he plunged the whole of Egypt into misery. And the very first of his crimes in the telling was a crime against belief itself. He closed the temples, all of them, across the length of the land. He forbade the priests to make their offerings, and cut the people off from the worship of the powers they revered, the sacred rites that gave their lives their shape and their hope. In a land as deeply devout as ancient Egypt, where the proper worship of those powers was believed to hold the very world in its order, this was an act almost beyond imagining, a war waged upon the soul of a whole people. That is how the legend opens its case, not with mere hardship, but with something like sacrilege, a king who set himself against the sacred order of his own nation. And then, tale went on, having shut the temples, Khufu turned the entire nation into a single vast gang of slaves. He forced all the Egyptians, so the story said, to labor for him without rest. Some were set to drag enormous blocks of stone from the quarries in the eastern hills down to the banks of the Nile. Others were made to haul those same blocks, once they had been ferried across the river, up onto the plateau. They toiled, the tale claimed, in gangs of 100,000 men at a time, each vast gang laboring for 3 whole months before another 100,000 came to take its place. For 10 long years, so the story ran, they labored merely to build the great causeway along which the stones would be dragged. And then for 20 years more they labored to raise the Great Pyramid itself. 30 years, a whole generation of a nation's life and strength and sweat, poured out, in the telling, upon the tomb of a single man, and the legend piled cruelty upon cruelty until the picture was complete. Herodotus recorded that Khufu, when at last his treasury ran dry from the sheer endless cost of the work, sank to a depth of shame almost beyond belief. He sent his own daughter, the story claimed, to sell her body for money to feed his hunger for stone. It is a lurid and a shocking detail, and we have already seen good reason to think it pure invention, a wandering motif of folklore rather than a fact of history. But within the legend, it serves its dark purpose perfectly. It draws the portrait of a king entirely without limit, a man who would spend his people and his treasury and even his own child upon the raising of his monstrous tomb. This is the Khufu of the story, and it matters to us tonight because of who comes next. For here, at last, our own subject steps onto the stage of the legend, and he steps onto it not as a hero, but as a villain. When Khufu at last died, the tale said, his brother Khafre took the throne of Egypt, and he behaved in precisely the same manner as the brother who had gone before him. He too, so the story went, kept the temples shut and the people cut off from their worship. He too drove the whole nation to labor, raising his own great pyramid on the plateau, close beside his brothers. In the legend, Khafre is given no character of his own at all, no separate soul, no distinct crimes. He is simply Khufu over again, a second cruel brother, The second act of a single long tragedy, the tyranny continued, the darkness prolonged, the misery of the people stretched out across yet another reign. That is the whole of what the legend allows him to be, a shadow of his brother, and Shenashao just as black. Between the two brothers, the tale reckoned, the temples of Egypt stood shut, and the people groaned in misery for 106 long years together, more than an entire century of darkness, of forced labor and of forbidden worship. And the people, the story said, came to hate these two kings with a hatred so deep and so lasting that even long ages afterward they could not bear to speak their names aloud. Instead, when they pointed to the great pyramids rising on the plateau, they would not call them by the names of the kings who had built them. They called them, so the tale claimed, after a humble shepherd named Philetus, who had pastured his flocks upon that plateau in the days of the building. To name the mightiest monuments on all the earth after an anonymous herdsman, rather than the kings who raised them, was, in the legend, the people's quiet revenge, a way of robbing the hated tyrants of even the fame they had bought at so terrible a price. And later writers only deepened the darkness further. The Egyptian priest Manetho remembered the builder of the Great Pyramid as a man who had grown arrogant and contemptuous toward the very powers his people held most sacred, echoing that same first charge of impiety. And the Greek writer Diodorus, repeating the old tales of a nation enslaved, added a haunting detail all his own. He wrote that the two kings had been so bitterly hated that they feared, even in death, the fury of their own people, and that when at last they died, their bodies were not laid to rest in the grand tombs they had built at all. Instead, so Diodorus claimed, they were hidden away in secret by those who buried them, for fear that the enraged mob might drag them from their resting places and tear them apart. Pause for a moment on that image. A king who builds the mightiest tomb in the whole history of the world and then dares not be buried within it. That is the final and most damning picture the ancient tradition leaves us with. Not merely a tyrant, but a tyrant so utterly loathed that his own great monument could not safely shelter his bones. That, then, is the case for the prosecution, drawn out in full, and there is no denying that it is a powerful one. A pair of monstrous brothers, shutting the temples, enslaving a nation, spending even their own children, hated so bitterly that their very names became unspeakable and their very bodies unsafe in the grave. For 2,000 years, this was very nearly the whole of what the world remembered of Khafre. And if it were true, then he would deserve to stand among the great villains of all human history. But is it true? That is the question. And now at last we may begin to answer it. Now we call our first witness for the defense. And our first witness is not a person at all, but a place. It is a lost town, buried and forgotten beneath the sand at the very foot of the pyramids. A town that no living soul even knew was there until our own age. And that turns out to have more to tell us about the men who built the pyramids than all the ancient writers put together. Let us go and dig it up. For most of the long centuries since Herodotus first wrote, no one could truly answer him, because no one knew where the pyramid builders had actually lived, or how, or who they had been. The great pyramids stood, empty and silent, and the workers who had raised them had vanished utterly, leaving, it seemed, no trace at all. Into that emptiness, the legend of the slaves had flowed, and there it had settled, unchallenged, for 2,000 years. But in recent decades, all of that changed. On the plateau at Giza, just to the south of the Great Sphinx, the archaeologists Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass began to dig into the sand, and slowly, season by season, they uncovered a whole lost settlement that no one had known was there. It was a town, a real and sprawling town, the very town of the pyramid builders, buried and preserved beneath the desert for 4,500 years. The excavators came to call it the Lost City. It was not the palace of a king, but something far more precious for our purposes tonight. It was the workaday world of the ordinary people who had actually raised the mountains, and from the very first, what it held began to contradict the legend. They found bakeries, whole rows of them, with the great vats and the bread molds for baking on an almost industrial scale, enough to feed a small army morning after morning. They found the traces of breweries, for the thick, nourishing beer that, together with bread, was the very staple of the Egyptian diet. And they found bones, the bones of animals in vast quantity, the remains of countless meals, cattle and sheep and goats. And when the researchers studied those bones and counted them and worked out what they meant, they reached a startling conclusion. The workers at Giza had been eating well, and eating a great deal of meat, far more meat, and of far better quality than ordinary Egyptian villagers would have seen from one year to the next. Prime cuts of beef were reaching the tables of common laborers on a regular basis now. This is simply not how you feed slaves. Slaves are fed as cheaply as they possibly can be, kept only barely alive, worked until they are used up. These workers were being provisioned, deliberately and generously, by the state, fed as valued men are fed. The very first thing the lost town whispers to us, out of the sand, is that the builders of the pyramids sat down to good bread and good beer and roasted meat. That is not the diet of the doomed, and it gets stranger. For when the excavators turned from the town to the cemetery of the workers, to the graves of the laborers and the craftsmen themselves, buried right there beside the great work of their lives, the bones told an even more surprising tale. Yes, the skeletons carried the plain marks of hard physical labor, the worn and thickened joints, the healed stresses and strains of people who had spent their lives shifting heavy stone. But they carried something else as well, something that no slave camp on earth would ever leave behind. They carried the clear signs of skilled medical care. Broken arms and broken legs had been carefully set, and had knitted back together and healed. There were even traces of far more serious treatment, of grave injuries survived, of the kind that could only possibly have mended if the injured worker had been taken out of the labor, looked after, fed and allowed to rest and recover across many long weeks and months. Someone was caring for these workers when they were hurt. Someone judged that their lives were worth the trouble of saving. And that is not the cold logic of slavery, which spends human lives as cheaply as firewood and throws away what breaks. That is the logic of a society that valued its builders and meant to keep them. And there was more still to be read in those graves. For some of these workers had not been tumbled into anonymous pits at all. They had been buried in small tombs of their own, modeled in miniature upon the fine tombs of the great, and carefully inscribed with their names and their proud titles. The overseer of the site of the pyramid, the director of the workers, the inspector of the craftsmen. These were people who were proud of what they did, proud enough to record it in stone for all eternity, and who were laid to rest close beside the very king they had served, as though there were honor in it, and not shame, to have helped raise his mountain. And upon the great stones themselves, up in the body of the pyramids and in the quarries, the work gangs had left their own private marks, the names they had chosen for themselves as teams. And those names are full to the brim with a rough good humor and a fierce and boastful loyalty. They called themselves such things as the Friends of Khufu, or the Followers of Menkaure, or, in at least one case that has come down to us, the Drunkards of Menkaure. These are not the names of the crushed, and the hopeless, and the enslaved. They are the banners of proud teams of free men, competing with one another, belonging to something greater than themselves, claiming their own share of the glory in the mightiest work of their whole age. So who were they then, these builders, if they were not the slaves of the legend? The picture that the evidence slowly builds for us is of an organized national workforce of a very particular kind. At its heart stood a body of skilled permanent workers, the master masons and the craftsmen and their trained crews, who lived there at Giza and labored the whole year round. But the great mass of the labor, the sheer weight of muscle needed to drag and lift the endless stone, came from ordinary people summoned in from the villages up and down the length of the valley, most likely for set stretches of duty, and above all during the season of the flood, when the fields lay drowned beneath the river, and there was simply no farming to be done. This was a system of labor owed, in their belief, to the king, a duty of service that later ages would come to call the corvée, and it was a world away from the chattel slavery of the legend. The workers were rotated, turned over so that no single person bore the whole crushing weight of it forever. They were housed, they were fed, as we have now seen, exceptionally well, and when they were injured, they were healed and made whole again. It was a demand upon the people, yes, a real and a heavy one, but it was the ordered demand of a state upon its own citizens, provisioned and bounded and woven into the year, and not the boundless and casual cruelty of a master over his slaves. And so, upon the very first, and the very greatest, of all the charges in the legend, the charge that Khafre and his brother enslaved a whole nation, the evidence returns a clear and a confident verdict. The men who built the pyramids were not slaves. The image of the whip, and the chain, and the starving multitude dying beneath the lash, so vivid in the legend, and so beloved ever since of films and paintings and popular tales, simply does not match a single solid thing that has come up out of the ground at Giza. Instead, the patient earth shows us fed and housed and tended and organized and even proud workers, some of whom chose to spend eternity buried beside the very monuments that they had helped to raise. The first charge, the great foundation upon which the whole dark legend was built, does not survive its first real contact with the physical evidence. It falls, and when the first and heaviest charge falls so completely, we are surely right to look very hard indeed at all the others that were built upon it. So let us turn now to the second charge, the charge of impiety, the closing of the temples and the war waged upon the worship of the people. And there too the evidence has a great deal to tell us. The second great charge against Khafre is the charge of impiety, the accusation that he closed the temples across the whole of Egypt, forbade the people their worship, and cut them off from the powers they revered for 100 years and more. If the charge of slavery struck at the bodies of the Egyptians, this second charge strikes at something even deeper, at their very souls, at the sacred order they believed held the whole world together. It is, in the moral shape of the legend, the darkest crime of all. So let us weigh it, as carefully as we weighed the first, and see whether it stands any more firmly than slavery did. Let us begin with its sheer implausibility. The tale claims that the temples of Egypt stood shut, and all worship was forbidden, for 106 unbroken years, across the reigns of both brothers together. But consider, for a moment, what that would actually have meant. The religion of ancient Egypt was not some occasional observance, set aside for holy days, and otherwise forgotten. It was the very framework of their entire world, woven into every season, every harvest, every act of the state, every hope for the life beyond. And the temples were far more than places of prayer. They were vast centers of the economy, holding great estates of land and stores of grain, employing armies of priests and workers, standing at the very heart of the administration of the kingdom. To close every temple in the land for over a century, and forbid all worship, would have torn the whole of Egyptian society apart, root and branch. No state on earth could have survived such a thing, let alone a state at the very height of its wealth and its organization. A state capable, in those very years, of raising the greatest monuments in the history of the world. The claim simply collapses beneath its own weight the moment we set it down and examine it. 100 years of shuttered temples is not the memory of any real policy that was ever carried out. It is the shape of a legend, stretched and exaggerated for the sake of its moral force. And when we turn from the legend to look at what Khafre actually did, we find not a man at war with the sacred at all, but a man steeped in it to his very core, a builder and a servant of the holy order of his age. Consider first his very name. Khafre means, in the old language of Egypt, something close to appearing like Ra, or rising like Ra, weaving into the king's own name the name of the power the Egyptians revered above all as the sun. Consider the proud title that he bore, the title Son of Ra, by which he declared himself, in their belief, to be the very child of that solar power. These are not the names and titles of a man contemptuous of what his people held sacred. Consider the great valley temple that he raised, one of the finest sacred buildings of the whole Old Kingdom, and the mortuary temple set against the eastern face of his pyramid, where priests were richly endowed to perform the eternal rituals for his spirit. Consider his statues, in which the falcon of the power they called Horus is shown wrapped protectively about his head, declaring in hard stone the sacred nature that the Egyptians believed their living king to hold. Everything that Khafre left behind him is soaked through with the religious life of his age. He did not close the temples of Egypt. He built them and endowed them and filled them with his own sacred image, and the religious life of Egypt did not cease under Khafre. It flowed on, entirely unbroken. The priesthoods continued their work. The offerings continued to be made. Indeed, Khafre himself established priesthoods and rich endowments to serve his own funerary cult, and those priests and their offerings and their careful rituals went on for generations after his death, some of them, by the evidence we possess, for whole centuries. Far from suppressing the worship of his people, Khafre added to it, founding new sacred institutions that would outlive him by ages upon ages. This is the precise and exact opposite of what the legend claims. The tale says that he shut belief down and starved the sacred order. The evidence says that he was one of its great patrons and builders, that under his reign the whole sacred machinery of Egypt ran on at its full and confident strength, and that his own cult became a living part of it for hundreds of years after he was gone. If we are truly searching for a king who made war upon the temples, we shall have to look somewhere very far from Khafre, for the stones that he left behind will not support the charge for a single moment. Where, then, did this strange and serious charge of impiety ever come from? We can begin to guess at its root, and we shall look harder at the whole question a little later in our night. Perhaps the sheer, overwhelming concentration of a nation's wealth and labor upon the royal tombs in the great age of the pyramids drew resources away from other things, and was remembered, dimly and bitterly across the centuries, as a kind of sacred neglect. Perhaps the towering power of the kings of this age, and the rise of the solar belief unsettled the older ways of things, and left behind a faint folk memory of upheaval and disorder. Or perhaps, most simply of all, the legend needed its tyrants to be impious, because in the neat moral shape of such a tale, cruelty toward men and contempt toward the sacred go naturally hand in hand, the one confirming the other. But whatever its true root may have been, the charge itself, once it is tested against the evidence of Khafre's own deeply religious monuments and his long-enduring cult, cannot stand. Upon the second charge, exactly as upon the first, the verdict of the evidence is clear and plain. The tyrant who closed the temples never was. In his place there stands a king who built them. And if the very man who wove the name of the sun into his own and set the sacred falcon upon the backs of his statues, and endowed whole priesthoods to sing his rites for centuries after his death, could nonetheless be remembered down the ages as an enemy of the temples, then we begin to sense just how very far a legend can drift from the truth it claims to be preserving. The distance between the pious builder of the evidence and the temple-closing tyrant of the tale is not some small and forgivable error. It is a chasm, and a chasm as wide as that one ought to make us wonder, very seriously indeed, how it ever came to open in the first place. That, as it happens, is the very question toward which our whole inquiry is now quietly bending. The third charge is the broadest of the three, and in some ways the very hardest to pin down. The charge of cruelty itself, the sweeping claim that under Khafre and his brother, the whole of Egypt groaned in unbroken misery, a nation ground down and suffering for more than 100 years. How does one test a charge as vague and as vast as universal misery? We do it in the only way we can. We look at the traces that a truly miserable age leaves behind it in the ground, and we compare them, carefully, to the traces that Khafre's age actually left. And when we do, the contrast turns out to be very sharp indeed. Look first at the tombs of the ordinary people who lived and died under Khafre, the officials and the courtiers and their families, clustered thickly around his pyramid upon the plateau. These are not the mean and hasty and impoverished graves of a broken and suffering people. They are well built and carefully decorated and richly provisioned, the resting places of men and women who were plainly comfortable and secure and prosperous in their lives. When archaeologists read the quality and the quiet confidence of these private tombs, they read behind them a settled and a well-fed ruling class, and behind that class in turn, a whole kingdom running smoothly, its granaries full, and its people at their work. A society caught in the grip of a century of grinding, hopeless misery does not lay its people to rest like this. The very stones of Khafre's Egypt, in tomb after tomb, speak clearly of plenty and not of suffering. Look, too, at the art. The reign of Khafre produced some of the very finest sculpture ever created in all the long history of Egypt, and the art of Egypt is among the greatest the world has ever known. His diorite statue, that calm and flawless seated figure with which we are now so familiar, is a masterpiece of such surpassing skill and such serene and untroubled confidence that it still ranks among the supreme achievements of ancient art anywhere on earth. Now, consider carefully what it actually takes to produce art of this kind. It takes master craftsmen trained and refined across many long years. It takes wealth and leisure and steady patronage and a settled confidence in the future. It takes a society secure enough and rich enough and calm enough to pour its very finest talents into the making of beauty. Art of this quality simply does not come out of a terrorized slave state groaning under a century of misery. It comes out of a confident, wealthy, stable, and flourishing civilization, standing at the very height of its powers. The masterpieces of Khafre's reign are, in themselves, a kind of silent testimony, and what they testify to with every perfect line is not misery at all, but a golden age. Look, finally, at the long reach and the deep order of the state that Khafre actually ruled. His expeditions traveled out to the far deserts of Nubia for the hard, dark stone of his statues, to the harsh mines of the Sinai for turquoise and for copper, to the distant harbors of the northern coast, for the tall cedar wood that his own land could not grow. This is not the behavior of a kingdom collapsing inward under the weight of its own cruelty. It is the behavior of a confident state reaching out across the whole of the known world, gathering up what it needed, its arm long and its grip sure and steady. And there is no sign at all, anywhere in his reign, of the things that mark real misery and real oppression. No evidence of revolt, no evidence of collapse, no famine, no breaking down of the fabric of society. On every measure that we are actually able to test, the age of Khafre looks like exactly what the evidence says that it was, one of the most stable and wealthy and confident periods in the entire history of ancient Egypt. And so, upon the third charge, just as upon the first two, the tyrant quietly dissolves before our eyes. The great misery was simply never there. Before we leave the courtroom altogether, two smaller charges from the legend deserve a moment of our attention as well, for they crumble every bit as readily as the great ones did. The first is the claim that the people hated these kings so very bitterly that they refused even to name the pyramids after them, and called them instead after a wandering shepherd named Philetus. It is a memorable detail, and a vivid one, but it runs headlong into a very simple fact. The Egyptians did name the pyramids, and they named them after the kings, and in the most honoring way that could be imagined. Each of the great pyramids bore a formal, sacred name of its own. Khufu's was called the Horizon of Khufu, and Khafre's own pyramid bore a name that meant simply and proudly, Khafre is great. These are not the names of monuments whose builders were despised and loathed and unspeakable. They are names of deep reverence, binding each mountain forever to the king who had raised it. As for the shepherd Philetus, no trace of him survives anywhere beyond that single garbled tale, and most who have studied it suspect that he never existed at all, or was some stray fragment of an unrelated story, tangled up in the accounts of the priests and passed along to a foreign traveler who could not tell the one thread from the other. The pyramids were named for their kings, and named with honor. The tale of the shepherd's quiet revenge is a legend nested inside a legend. The second small charge is the haunting one that Diodorus added to the tradition, the claim that the two kings were so feared and so hated that their very bodies had to be hidden away in secret, lest the raging mob tear them from their tombs. And here the legend seizes upon something entirely real, and twists it in precisely the way that we have now come to expect. For it is quite true that when Khafre's pyramid was at last opened in modern times, his great granite sarcophagus was found standing open and empty, and his body was gone. But the reason for that emptiness has nothing whatever to do with a vengeful mob, and everything to do with the plain and universal history of the tombs of Egypt. Almost every single royal tomb in the whole of Egypt was robbed in antiquity, broken open and stripped of its treasures, and very often of the royal body itself, by thieves hunting for gold, usually in the long dark centuries of disorder that came after the old kingdom had fallen. Khafre's tomb was emptied not by a hateful people, but by ordinary robbers, exactly as the tomb of his father was emptied, and his grandfather's, and very nearly every other king's of that distant age. The missing body is real enough, but it is not in the least the mark of a hated tyrant. It is the mark of a plundered grave, and there are almost no unplundered graves for it to be compared against. Once again, and for the last time, the legend has taken a single true fact, the empty tomb, and dressed it up in a false and a dramatic meaning. And yet we promised at the outset to be honest, and honesty now requires us to pause and to find the grain of real truth that is buried within the legend, for there is one, and it matters. It is this. The building of the pyramids was, in sober and undeniable fact, an enormous imposition upon the people of Egypt. It was one of the very largest concentrations of human labor and national wealth ever gathered together, anywhere, for a single purpose. For generations on end, the surplus of an entire nation, its spare food, its spare strength, its spare time, was directed, by the will of the king, toward the raising of royal tombs. The corvée was real, the heavy demand upon the villages was real, the sheer, staggering scale of the whole enterprise was real, and it is not at all hard to see how, across 2,000 years of retelling, the dim and fading memory of that colossal demand, of a whole people bent for generations to the king's great work, could slowly curdle and darken and harden into a tale of slavery and misery and cruelty. The legend, then, is not pure invention spun out of nothing. It is a real memory, distorted almost beyond recognition. It took the true fact of an immense royal demand upon the nation, and it twisted that fact, across long centuries of telling and retelling, into the false and lurid tale of whips and chains and shuttered temples. Our task tonight has never been to pretend that the pyramids cost the people nothing. They cost a very great deal. Our task has been to see clearly the difference between a heavy national duty, freely bound up with the deepest sacred beliefs of the age, and the monstrous chattel slavery of the legend. And that difference, once you see it, is vast. There is one final piece of honesty that we owe to the whole question, and it is this. Even now, when we have cleared away the worst of the legend, we still cannot see directly into Khafre's own heart. The evidence can tell us a great deal. It can tell us that his workers were fed and housed and tended when they were hurt. It can tell us that his temple stood open and that his cult endured for centuries. It can tell us that his age was prosperous and confident and stable. It can tell us what kind of state he ran and what kind of world he lived and ruled within. But it cannot tell us whether, as a private man, he was gentle or stern, patient or short-tempered, warm to those around him or cold. Perhaps he was a hard master. Perhaps he was a mild one. The silent stones do not say. What we can say, with real and solid confidence, is that the specific and terrible charges of the legend, the enslavement of the nation, the closing of the temples, the long century of engineered misery, are simply not true. The monstrous Khafre of the story never existed at all. The real Khafre remains, in the depths of his character, a mystery, as very nearly all people of that unimaginably distant age must forever remain to us. But he was not the tyrant of the tale. That much, at least, the patient evidence has now shown us beyond any reasonable doubt. So the trial in its main part is over, and upon every specific charge the legend has failed to stand. And that leaves us facing a new question, and a fascinating one, perhaps even more interesting than the question we began with. If the tyrant never truly existed, then where on earth did he come from? How did a confident and pious and prosperous king, a builder and a patron and a faithful servant of the sacred order of his people, come to be remembered, for 2,000 long years, as one of history's great monsters? How does a transformation like that actually happen? How does a legend of this kind take root and grow and harden into accepted truth, is the question we turn to now. As we leave the courtroom behind us and go searching instead for the strange and very human process by which the truth about Khafre was slowly buried and the myth of the tyrant slowly raised up in its place. It is, in the end, a story about memory itself and about the workings of time and about the many ways in which we, all of us, come to misremember our own past. So the tyrant of the legend never truly existed, and that leaves us facing our new and fascinating question. How, then, was he ever invented? How does a legend as dark and as durable as this one take root and grow and harden over the long centuries into what everyone simply knows to be true? To answer that, we have to follow the long road that the story traveled, all the way from Khafre's own distant age down to Herodotus and far beyond, and we have to understand the forces that shaped and darkened it at every step along the way. It is a story woven of several separate strands, and the first of those strands begins not with any single liar or villain, but with a catastrophe. Some centuries after Khafre had died, the great and confident Old Kingdom, that whole shining world of the pyramid builders, weakened and strained, and at last collapsed. The strong central state that had gathered the strength of a nation broke apart into pieces. Egypt fell into a long and painful age of division and hardship and disorder, which the scholars call the First Intermediate Period. Central authority failed, order broke down, and in that long time of trouble, the great tombs of the old kings, the pyramids of Giza among them, were broken open and plundered, their treasures carried off, their royal bodies scattered and lost. Now imagine for a moment what all of this did to the living memory of the Pyramid Age. The mightiest monuments in all the world now stood violated and robbed and empty, the abandoned works of kings whose golden order had failed and crumbled into dust. The pyramids, which had once stood as the proud symbols of a triumphant age, became instead the silent reminders of a vanished greatness and of an order that had fallen. And in the hard new world that followed, people looked back at those impossible mountains and at the collapse that had come after them, and a dark question must have hung in the very air. What kind of power, what kind of terrible demand upon a people could ever have raised such things as these? The seed of a darker memory was planted there among the ruins, and human memory across the long reach of centuries does not simply record the past as it was. It shapes it and reshapes it into stories, and above all into moral stories, into tales that carry a lesson within them. Look closely at the shape that the legend finally took in the pages of Herodotus. It is not a sober chronicle at all, it is a fable. First there is a good and a just king and a happy, prosperous, and pious land. Then comes the fall. Two proud and cruel brothers who enslave the whole people and shut up the temples, and who are hated bitterly for it across all the ages. And then at the last comes a kind of redemption. The pious Menkaure, the very son of the tyrant, who reopens the temples and rules his people with justice and is loved by them for it. It is the oldest and clearest shape of a moral tale, of overweening pride and cruelty at last brought low, of humility and justice at last rewarded. And yet, in one final and telling dark twist, even the good King Menkaure is made to suffer, dying young in spite of all his goodness, as though to whisper that the sins of the fathers must fall even upon the most righteous of sons. This is not the way that history actually unfolds. This is the way that stories are carefully built. The legend of Khafre had been slowly shaped, across 2,000 years, into a lesson about the deadly dangers of royal pride, and the shape of that lesson simply required him to play the part of the villain. And there is a deeper reason still why the pyramids drew such a dark story to themselves, a reason that we can feel even today, standing in their shadow. Stand before the Great Pyramid or before the Pyramid of Khafre and try honestly to imagine the sheer effort that raised it. The mind simply reels at it. Millions upon millions of blocks of stone, decades upon decades of ceaseless labor, the gathered strength of a whole entire nation. And a very natural thought arises, almost unbidden, in nearly every person who has ever looked upon them. Surely, to build a thing as vast as this, people must have suffered, and suffered terribly. Surely such monuments could only ever have been raised through cruelty and force, and the pitiless crushing of countless thousands of human lives. The sheer overwhelming scale of the pyramids seems, all by itself, to demand a story of mass suffering in order to explain it. The monuments became, in this way, their own silent accusation against the men who built them. It felt right. It felt fitting, and somehow just, that things so impossibly vast must surely have been born out of an equal measure of misery. And so, when a tale came along at last that said precisely this, that the Great Pyramids had been built by armies of slaves under the whips of cruel and godless kings, it fell upon ready and willing ears, and it has gone on falling upon ready ears in every age since. It matched perfectly the very feeling that the pyramids themselves produce in us. But a feeling, however powerful and however deep, is still not the same thing as a fact, and the patient evidence, as we have already seen tonight, tells us a very different story indeed. We should be careful, though, not to lay the whole of the legend at the feet of the Greeks, for that would be far too simple, and not quite fair. The dark reputation of the Pyramid Kings seems to have had its roots in Egypt itself, long before Herodotus ever set foot in the land. There survives an old Egyptian story, written down in a text that scholars call the Westcar Papyrus, in which King Khufu appears as a character in his own right. And in that story he is not painted as a warm or a gentle or a kindly man. In one striking and rather chilling moment, when Khufu is told of a magician who can supposedly restore a head that has been cut off, the king casually proposes that a living prisoner be fetched and beheaded on the spot, so that the wonder might be tested upon him. The magician recoils and refuses, insisting that such a thing must never be worked upon a living human being. Now, this is only a tale, and it should not be taken as sober history any more than the stories of Herodotus should. But it shows us something genuinely important. It shows that even within Egyptian storytelling itself, a certain memory of the great pyramid builder as a hard and imperious and faintly menacing figure was already in the air. And Manetho, the Egyptian priest, likewise remembered that builder as a man who had grown contemptuous toward the sacred order. So the dark reputation was never simply a foreign slander, invented out of nothing by curious Greek travelers. It was, in some real part, an Egyptian memory already old and already shadowed, which the Greeks then received and repeated and hardened into the shape we know. And once such a memory begins to travel down through time, it changes and it darkens at every single telling. Consider the long and broken chain by which this story finally reached us. It began perhaps as a genuine folk memory of the immense demands of the Pyramid Age and of the great collapse that had followed it. It was then carried down through countless generations of Egyptians, shifting and simplifying and darkening as it went. By the time Herodotus at last arrived to hear it, 2,000 whole years had already passed since Khafre had lived and died. The priests and the guides who told him these tales were themselves separated from the actual pyramid builders by a gulf of time every bit as vast as the one that today separates us from those same ancient Greeks. They told him only what they in turn had been told, which was already legend, already worn smooth by the ages. And Herodotus, who did not himself speak their tongue, received all of it through the mouths of interpreters, and wrote down what he understood them to mean, which may not always have been what they were truly saying. Across a chain as long and as fragile as that, names blur into one another, separate events merge together, the deeds of one king are quietly attached to another, and the whole slowly becomes a kind of composite shadow, a single legend of the Pyramid Kings in general, draped loosely over the particular figures of Khufu and of Khafre. It is very nearly a wonder that anything true at all survived the journey, and a great deal that was false came down the chain along with it. And once the legend had been written down by so famous and so respected a hand as that of Herodotus, it took on a powerful life of its own, and it only grew stronger with each passing age. Diodorus repeated it, even as he openly doubted it. Later writers took it up in their turn. And then, in the modern age, the old image of the pyramids raised by suffering slaves was cemented more deeply than ever before, not by scholars at all, but by popular story, and above all by the moving picture. The great films of the last century showed the whole world, vast, sweating multitudes of slaves toiling and dying under the crack of the whip to raise the mighty monuments of Egypt, and that image was burned forever into the imagination of all mankind. It drew a further, borrowed strength from a loose and mistaken association with the ancient story of a people held in bondage in Egypt, though that story, whatever its true origins, is set in a far later age of the world, and has nothing whatever to do with the building of the pyramids of Giza, more than 1,000 years before it. But in the popular mind, all of it simply melted together into a single picture: Egypt, and pyramids and slaves and whips and endless suffering. The legend that had begun as an ancient Egyptian folk memory, and had then been written down by a wandering Greek, was at the last fixed permanently in the modern imagination by the flickering light of the cinema screen. And so it is that, 4,500 years after Khafre fed and housed and healed his free and willing workers, a great part of the whole world still half believes to this day that he drove armies of slaves to their deaths beneath his mountain. And yet, running quietly alongside the dark legend all through the long centuries, there was always another current as well, a current of reverence and of awe that the tyrant tale never quite managed to drown out. For even as the story of the cruel kings was told and retold, the monuments themselves went on inspiring wonder in all who saw them. Later Egyptian kings, in ages long after Khafre, came to the Giza Plateau and honored it, clearing the drifted sand away from the Sphinx and revering it, in their belief, as the embodiment of a solar power that they called Horemakhet. The pyramids were counted, in time, among the very wonders of the world, the greatest of them all, and the only ones that still survive. Khafre's cult endured. His statues were preserved and treasured. And so the memory of Khafre was, in truth, always a double thing: the cruel tyrant of the folk tale on the one hand, and the mighty builder of awe-inspiring wonders on the other, the two of them running side by side down the centuries. And in the end, it was that second current, the current of wonder, that drew to the plateau the scholars and the diggers who would at last recover the buried truth. The dark legend held the field for a very long time, but it could not hold it forever because it carried within it one fatal weakness. It could be tested. As the modern study of Egypt slowly began, and explorers and scholars came to the plateau, and dug down into the sand, and learned to read the stones, the legend began, gradually, to give way before the weight of the evidence. The lost town of the workers was found. The ancient papyri were recovered and read. The tombs of the officials were studied and understood. And piece by piece, the real Khafre, the confident builder, the patron of belief, the ruler of a stable and prosperous age, was drawn back up out of the ground and set down beside the tyrant of the tale, so that all could see that the two of them could not possibly both be true. The evidence, gathered slowly and carefully across 2 centuries, did the one thing that 2,000 years of storytelling never could. It gave Khafre back something very like his true face. The tyrant, in the end, was not defeated by a better story. He was defeated by the ground itself. And there is a wider truth here, one that reaches far beyond the single figure of Khafre, and it is well worth pausing upon. For the strange fate of Khafre is not at all unique to him. Across the whole long span of history, great builders and great rulers have again and again been remembered as tyrants, their very monuments taken by later ages as the proof of their cruelty. The equation runs very deep in us, deeper than reason, that grandeur must somehow mean oppression, that vast works must always be born of vast suffering, and sometimes it is true enough. Power has very often been cruel, and many a monument was indeed raised in blood. But not always, and never quite so simply as the legends would have it. The real lesson of Khafre is that we must be careful, and slow to judge, that we cannot read a ruler's heart straight off the sheer size of the monuments he left behind, and that the story a great building seems to be telling us may be very far indeed from the story the patient evidence actually tells. To judge the past truly and fairly, We have to dig down beneath the powerful feeling that the monuments stir in us and ask instead what the ground itself actually shows. And when we take the trouble to do that, the past very often turns out to be stranger and more human and a great deal less simple than any of the legends will allow. To understand how the pyramid legend could ever form and then survive so long, it helps a great deal to see the company that it kept within Herodotus's own account. For his Egypt is a land quite awash in wonderful stories. Just before he comes to the tale of the cruel pyramid kings, Herodotus tells the long and delightful story of a master thief who again and again outwits a king's every effort to catch him, a clever folk tale of trickery and wit that has close cousins in the storytelling of many other lands and ages. His Egypt is simply full of such things, marvels and moral tales and clever legends one after another, and the story of the cruel pyramid builders is not set apart from all of these as a sober historical record standing alone. It sits right down among them, one legend in a whole flowing sea of legends, and that is precisely how we ought to read it. Not as some stray hard fact that happened to fall into a history book, but as one tale among a great many, gathered up by a traveler who dearly loved a good story in a land that had no shortage of them to tell. And we should ask, too, a simple question that is easy to overlook. Why did the Egyptian priests themselves choose to tell the story in the particular shape that they did? By the time that Herodotus came to hear it, the pyramid kings were already figures of an almost unimaginable antiquity, 2,000 years gone into the past, as remote and as legendary to those priests as they are to us today. And such distant figures very easily become vessels, empty shapes into which a later age can pour its own moral lessons. It costs a storyteller nothing at all to make a long-dead king the villain of a cautionary tale about the deadly dangers of pride and impiety, and it costs still less in an age that prized, above almost all things, the proper honoring of the temples and of the powers they revered. The sharp contrast that the priests drew between the impious builders who shut the temples and the pious king who threw them open again was itself a kind of quiet sermon, a lesson in the very values they held most dear, dressed up in the borrowed costume of the deep past. The pyramid kings, in other words, may well have been cast as tyrants, not because anyone truly remembered them as such, but simply because the story needed its tyrants in order to make its point about piety and pride. There is something here worth understanding about the very nature of memory itself. Across such enormous spans of time, when a story is carried only by word of mouth, down through 100 generations of tellers, it does not stay still and it does not stay pure. It simplifies, it sharpens. Its complicated truths slowly dissolve into simple and memorable and satisfying shapes. And as it travels, it gathers to itself what we might call floating motifs, stray elements of story that drift freely from tale to tale and settle wherever they happen to fit. That lurid detail of the king who sells his own daughter for stone is very likely one of exactly these, a wandering motif of pure wickedness that attached itself to Khufu simply because he had already been cast as the great villain of the piece. This is how legends are truly built, not by a single bold act of invention by one person sitting down to lie, but by the slow, blind accretion of shape and motif and moral across the centuries, until the original truth is buried so very deep beneath it all that no one can any longer dig it out. The tyrant Khafre is a creature of exactly that long process, assembled piece by piece out of collapse and moral instinct and wandering folklore across 2,000 years of telling. And against the whole weight of that dark tradition, there stands one more quiet piece of evidence, carved plainly in stone, that gives the lie to the tale of the hated kings. For between the two great outstretched paws of the Sphinx, there stands to this day a tall slab of carved stone, set there more than 1,000 years after Khafre had died, by a young king of the later New Kingdom named Thutmose, and upon that slab is carved a story. It tells how, as a prince before he had come to the throne, he had been out hunting near the Sphinx and had lain down to rest in its shadow and had fallen asleep, and had dreamed that the great monument itself spoke to him and promised him the very crown of Egypt, if only he would clear away the sand that had risen up and buried its mighty body. And clear it away he did. Now we may set the dream itself entirely to one side. What truly matters for us is the reverence. More than 1,000 years after Khafre, the single greatest monument of his reign was not shunned, and it was not despised as the shameful work of a loathed tyrant. It was honored, it was cared for, it was dug free of the choking sand by the hands of a king, and treated as a thing of deep and sacred power, well worth the labor. That is not how the memory of a hated oppressor is ever treated. It is how the works of a revered ancestor are treated. The stone that stands between the paws of the Sphinx is a witness in the trial we have been holding all through this night, and its silent testimony flatly contradicts the legend. And before we finally leave the wider story behind, we ought to turn its lesson gently back upon ourselves, for the very process that slowly made a monster out of Khafre has not stopped working. It is at work still, all around us, even now, in the way that we remember the powerful and the famous of our own age. We flatten complicated people into simple heroes and simple villains. We let a single dramatic story, whether it is true or false, stand in for the whole of a life. We look upon a person's monuments, their great public works, and their public deeds, and we imagine, quite wrongly, that we therefore know their heart. And as the years pass and memory fades and the stories harden into what everyone knows, the real and complicated person quietly slips away from us, and only the legend is left behind. Khafre is only an ancient and an extreme example of something that happens, sooner or later, to very nearly everyone who is remembered at all. And so his story is at once a warning and an invitation. It asks us to hold our confident judgments of the distant past and of one another alike a little more lightly than we do, and to remember, always, how very easily the whole truth about a single human being can be lost. There is a further crack that opens in the moral fable, once we look closely at it, and it lies in the very figure of the good king himself. The legend makes Menkaure the gentle redeemer, the son who reopened the temples and set the suffering people free. And yet Menkaure, this son of the supposed tyrant, also built a great pyramid of his own upon that very same plateau, a royal tomb that also required the organized labor of the whole nation, drawn from the same villages, gathered by the same system of duty owed to the king. If the mere building of a pyramid was enough to make Khafre a slave-driving tyrant, then it ought, in fairness, to have made Menkaure one too, for he did precisely the same thing in his turn. But the legend does not notice this at all. It cannot afford to, for it needs its sharp contrast, its villain, set against its saint, and that blindness is itself deeply telling. The very same act, the raising of a royal pyramid, is condemned as monstrous cruelty in the father, and passed over in complete silence in the son, purely because the story has already decided, in advance, who is to be wicked and who is to be good. That is not history reasoning carefully from the evidence. That is a fable arranging its characters upon the stage. And once you have seen the arrangement for what it is, the whole neat moral shape of the tale reveals itself as a careful construction, and not as a memory at all. The fable needed a monster and it needed a saint. And so, across the long centuries, it quietly manufactured both, out of two brothers and a son who had, in plain truth, all of them done very much the same thing, each in his own turn, upon that same patient stretch of desert. And there is one last mark of the legend stamped upon the tale, a kind of fingerprint that quietly betrays its true nature, and that is its habit of wild and sweeping exaggeration. Look again at the numbers that the story reaches for. 100,000 men, all laboring at a single time, 106 unbroken years of shuttered temples. These are not the careful, sober figures of a genuine record. They are the great swelling numbers of a legend, chosen for their sheer weight and their horror, rather than for any truth in them. 106 years of closed temples is, as we have already seen, a plain impossibility that no state on earth could have survived. 100,000 men toiling at one single moment is a figure lying far beyond anything the actual evidence of the workforce suggests, for that evidence points instead to organized and provisioned crews numbering in the thousands, rotating steadily through the seasons of the year. When a story reaches so very eagerly for such vast and round and terrible numbers, it is telling us something important about its own nature. It is not counting anything. It is trying to impress us. It is reaching for awe and for horror, and both of those are the well-worn tools of the storyteller, and not of the honest historian. The sheer scale of the legend's claims is itself one more clear sign that we stand, all along, in the presence of a tale, and not of a true record. So we have now followed the long and winding road of the legend, all the way from the ruins of the fallen old kingdom to the flickering light of the modern cinema screen, and we have watched, step by step, how a confident and a pious king was slowly turned into a monster in the memory of the entire world. But at every single turn of that road, we have leaned upon a body of hard physical evidence, the lost town of the workers, the ancient papyri, the tombs, the statues, which we have so far only glimpsed as we hurried past. It is time now to look upon that evidence far more closely, at the actual digging down in the sand and at the actual finds that came up out of it, and at the named men and women of our own age who patiently recovered them. And it is time, too, to go and stand at the strange and shifting frontier of the science itself, where great machines now peer deep inside the pyramids without so much as touching a single stone, and where, even in our own day, new and wild claims still rise up out of nowhere, and must be carefully weighed and tested and judged. Let us turn now to the evidence itself, and to the genuine strangeness that always seems to gather at its very edges. We have now heard the accusation in full, and cross-examined it, charge by charge, and traced the long road by which it grew. Let us stand a while longer, then, with the physical evidence itself, with those silent witnesses that finally overturn the ancient legend, and look at them more closely, for the story of their recovery is a fascinating one in its own right. For most of the long centuries since Herodotus wrote, the tyrant legend simply could not be challenged, however much a careful mind might doubt it, because the evidence needed to challenge it lay buried and forgotten beneath the sand, unknown to anyone. The great turning point came only in our own age, with the slow and patient work of archaeology, and the single most important discovery of them all was the finding of the town of the workers. For a very long time, one great question had hung unanswered over the whole plateau. Where, in the name of all reason, had the tens of thousands of pyramid builders actually lived? The pyramids themselves stood plain for all to see, but the vast multitude of people who had raised them seemed to have vanished from the earth without a trace, leaving no home, no hearth, no grave that anyone could find. And then, in the closing decades of the last century, and the opening years of this one, two archaeologists, the American Mark Lenner and the Egyptian Zahi Hawass, working together upon the plateau, turned their attention to the low ground lying to the south of the Great Sphinx and began carefully to dig. And there, beneath the sand, season by season, they uncovered it at last. A vast settlement laid out with streets and long galleries and workshops and storerooms, the very town in which the builders of the pyramids had lived and eaten and slept. It took years, and then decades, of painstaking excavation to bring its full shape into the light. The long galleries where the workers may have slept in their rotating crews, the great bakeries, the breweries, the storehouses, an administrative quarter, and the bones of the enormous herds of cattle and sheep and goats that had been driven in from across the land to feed the laboring host. The excavators came to call it the lost city of the pyramid builders. It stands among the most important discoveries in the entire history of Egyptian archaeology, and it spoke, directly and plainly and unanswerably, to the very question that the legend had for so long answered so falsely. We have already seen what it said, that the workers were fed well, and housed, and tended in their injuries, and buried at last with honor close beside the monuments they had raised. The lost city is the great witness for the defense, and it was hidden in the sand the whole time, waiting only to be asked. But the town of the workers, for all its importance, was very far from the only witness that the patient earth would give up. In the year 2013, far away from Giza, upon the lonely shore of the Red Sea, a French geologist named Pierre Tallet made a discovery of a wholly different and altogether extraordinary kind. Excavating the remains of an ancient harbor at a place called Wadi al-Yarf, he came upon a store of papyri, hidden away and preserved in the dry rock, and they proved to be the very oldest inscribed papyri ever found anywhere in the entire world. And they dated from the reign of none other than Khafre's own father, the King Khufu, the first of the great pyramid builders of Giza, the very first of the tyrants of the legend. Among these ancient papyri was a set of documents that scholars now call the Diary of Merer, and it is a thing to marvel at, for it is the actual day-by-day logbook of a working official named Merer, a man who commanded a team of laborers during the reign of Khufu in the great age of the building of the Great Pyramid. And in this humble logbook, set down more than 4,500 years ago, Merer simply records the ordinary business of his days. He writes of how his team ferried great blocks of the fine white limestone from the royal quarries at Tura across the river to the vast building site of the pyramid, journey after patient journey, load after load. It is, in the truest sense that could be meant, the closest thing we possess anywhere to an eyewitness account of the building of a pyramid, written by a man who was actually there, and who did the work with his own hands and his own crew. And here is the thing that matters most for the trial we have been holding. What Merer's diary shows us is a workforce that is carefully organized and regularly provisioned and purposefully directed, and it is not, in any line of it, a workforce of slaves. Marer's men are issued their rations. They are moved about the country according to a considered plan. They are a proud and functioning part of a great, ordered, national enterprise. There is not so much as a single whisper of slavery anywhere within it, only the calm and patient logistics of a well-run and confident state. This one document, written in Khafre's own age, and buried for 4,500 years, speaks directly and quietly against the whole of the legend, in the plain and honest voice of a man who was truly there to see. There is another kind of evidence, quieter than a lost city or an ancient diary, but every bit as telling in its way, and it lies within the stones themselves, in what patient measurement can reveal about how they were made. Over the past 2 centuries, surveyors and scholars have measured the pyramids of Giza with ever greater and greater precision, and what they find again and again is a mastery that speaks not at all of a terrorized rabble driven along by whips, but of highly skilled and superbly organized craftsmen working at the very height of their art. The base of Khafre's pyramid is a great square, each of its sides running more than 200 meters in length, and those sides are aligned to the 4 points of the compass with an accuracy that, given the simple tools of the age, seems almost beyond belief, and the vast base is very nearly perfectly level across the whole of its enormous spread. The great blocks are fitted together with extraordinary care and exactness. The numbers are striking. Here is a monument of many millions of tons of stone, laid out and leveled and aligned by people who possessed only copper tools and rope and timber and their own hard-won skill, to a degree of precision that modern builders, for all their lasers and their instruments, must still labor to match. And here is the crucial point for our long trial. Precision of this order is simply not the work of misery. It is the work of pride and of skill and of careful and confident organization. You do not draw work as fine as this out of a broken slave gang driven under the lash. You draw it out of master craftsmen who know their trade to its depths and take a fierce pride in it. The very perfection of the pyramids is itself a quiet testimony against the legend. And then, of course, there is the art. The reign of Khafre produced sculpture of a surpassing and enduring beauty, and above all that calm and flawless seated figure, the diorite Tcho, carved from one of the very hardest stones to be found anywhere on earth, a stone that had to be brought across hundreds of miles of empty desert from a remote quarry deep in Nubia. Consider once again what a work of that kind actually requires. It requires master sculptors, trained and refined across many years. It requires wealth enough to keep and to fund them. It requires the long reach to bring so rare and so difficult a stone across the wastes. And it requires a deep and settled confidence, the calm of a society secure enough in itself to pour its very finest talent into the patient making of beauty. This is not, and could never be, the art of a suffering and terrorized and enslaved age. It is the art of a wealthy, and a stable, and a flourishing civilization, standing at the very peak of its powers and its confidence. The masterpieces of Khafre's reign are, in and of themselves, a kind of verdict. And the verdict that they hand down is a golden age, and not a reign of misery. And there is one further kind of evidence, one that is very easy to overlook, but that becomes quietly powerful the moment you learn to see it. It is the evidence of what is simply not there. For if Khafre had truly closed the temples and made war upon the belief of his people, then we should surely expect to find the plain marks of it left behind in the ground. The ruins of shrines torn down, the traces of cults abruptly abandoned, some sharp and unmistakable break in the whole religious life of the land. And we find nothing of the kind. The cults flow on, unbroken. The temples go on functioning. Khafre's own religious foundations endure and are served for centuries. And likewise, if his long reign had truly been a full century of grinding misery and mass enslavement, then we should surely expect to find the marks of that as well, the signs of revolt, of famine, of collapse, of a whole society straining and breaking apart at its seams. And we find none of those things either. Instead, we find prosperity and stability and a flowering of the arts and the long confident reach of a well-ordered state. The silence of the evidence, precisely where the legend insists that there ought to be screaming, is itself a most powerful witness. The very things that a real and terrible tyranny would have been certain to leave behind it are simply and entirely absent from the record, and their absence speaks every bit as loudly as any ancient diary or any lost and buried city. So let us gather up all of the witnesses for the defense, at the last, and see how they stand together, shoulder to shoulder. There is the lost city of the workers, with its bread and its beer, and its healed and mended bones. There is the cemetery of those same workers, with its honored and carefully named dead. There is the diary of the official mirror, with its organized and provisioned and purposeful crews. There is the sheer precision of the stones, speaking so clearly of skill and of pride. There are the masterpieces of the art, speaking so clearly of wealth and of confidence. And there is that great and telling absence, the wholly missing marks of a tyranny that never in fact was. And set against all of these, the legend has, in the end, nothing whatever but a handful of old tales, gathered at third hand, 2,000 years after the events they claim to describe, and already openly doubted, as we have seen, by the ancients themselves. It is not, when you look at it squarely, close case at all. On every single point that can actually be tested against the world, the evidence and the legend point in flatly opposite directions, and it is the evidence, every time, that prevails. The tyrant Khafre dissolves before it, like mist in the morning sun, and in his place there stands the real one, the one the stones remember, a builder and a patron and the confident ruler of a golden age. And yet we cannot leave the evidence behind without walking, for a little while, along its very strangest edge, for ancient Egypt, more than almost any subject on earth, draws wild and wonderful claims to itself the way a bright lamp draws moths in the dark. Around the pyramids there has always swirled a thick fog of extraordinary theories, that they were raised by visitors from another world, or by the survivors of some lost and drowned super-civilization, or that they conceal deep beneath the sand vast secret chambers and hidden halls of forgotten and forbidden knowledge. And there is a strange and quiet irony hiding here, one that is very much worth our noticing tonight. For the slave legend that we have spent this whole long night carefully taking apart is itself, in its own way, one of these very things, a piece of inherited pseudo-history, an old and comfortable story that the hard evidence simply overturns. But the modern fringe theories tend to push in precisely the opposite direction from the legend, and in doing so, they fall, curiously, into the very same underlying error. For the wild theories, whether they credit the building of the pyramids to travelers from the stars or to the wise refugees of a sunken Atlantis, all of them quietly share a single hidden assumption. It is the assumption that ordinary human beings simply could not possibly have built such things as these. And that assumption, however grandly it may dress itself up, is in truth the very same insult that lies buried at the dark heart of the slave legend itself. Both of them, in the end, take the great achievement away from the very people who actually made it. The slave legend says, yes, they built it, but only under the whip and only in misery and chains. The theory of the aliens says, no, they could never have built it at all. And both of them, in their different ways, refuse to grant the ancient Egyptians the one thing that they most richly deserve, which is the simple credit for their own astonishing work. And the patient evidence, gathered so carefully out of the ground, refutes the both of them together, for it shows us free and skilled and well-fed workers, organized and provisioned by a confident and capable state, raising these mountains by their own gathered strength and their own hard-won genius. The truth, in the end, honors the builders. The legends of every kind only rob them, and the wild claims are not merely a thing of the distant past. They still arise even now in our own day. Very recently, a group of researchers claimed, upon the basis of a certain kind of radar analysis, to have detected a huge and hidden complex of shafts and chambers, even a vast underground city, plunging hundreds of meters down beneath the pyramid of Khafre. The claim raced, within days, all the way around the world. But we must be very plain and honest about exactly what it is. It has not been published in any serious or reviewed scientific journal. It rests upon a method that the great majority of experts say simply cannot see structures at such enormous depths in anything like the way that is being claimed. No excavation has confirmed even the smallest part of it, and the leading authorities upon the plateau have firmly and flatly rejected it, none more so than the veteran Egyptologist Zahi Hawass, who has spent a whole lifetime upon that very ground, and who dismissed the claims outright as baseless, as fabrications quite unsupported by any real evidence at all. And this is simply how careful and honest science treats such a claim, not with breathless excitement, but with a steady and patient demand for evidence, and then, when that evidence is nowhere to be found, with a clear and calm and quite unembarrassed no. Set against all of these fireworks, the real frontier of the science is a far quieter thing, and a far more patient one, and in the end a far more wonderful one. For in our own day, researchers have brought to the plateau the genuine tools of advanced physics, using tiny particles called muons, which rain down ceaselessly from the upper air, and which can pass clean through solid stone, International teams such as the Scan Pyramids effort have begun to map the hidden interiors of the Great Pyramids without so much as disturbing a single block, much as an X-ray quietly reveals the inside of a living body. In very recent work, attention has moved across the plateau, and careful studies have probed for hidden voids and empty spaces, with Khafre's own Great Pyramid standing among the targets for this patient and non-destructive looking. This is science at its very best, humble and careful, refusing to break the thing that it studies, and willing, above all, to wait. And behind all of it lies a quiet assumption that every serious scholar shares, that the plateau of Giza, even now, after 2 whole centuries of digging, has still not told us everything that it knows. Return for just a moment to the buildings that Khafre actually left behind him, for they too stand among the witnesses, and their testimony is an eloquent one. Chief among them is his Valley Temple, the great gateway that once stood at the very foot of his causeway, closed down beside the water's edge. It is one of the best preserved buildings to have come down to us from the whole of the Old Kingdom, and to step inside it, even today, is to step directly into the living world of Khafre's own age. Its walls were built from truly colossal blocks of limestone, some of them weighing many tons apiece, and faced with polished red granite floated all the way down the river from distant Aswan, and fitted together with a care and an exactness that still astonishes the masons who study it now. Its floor was paved with pale and softly glowing alabaster. And consider for a moment what this one building alone quietly tells us. It tells us of immense skill. It tells us of great wealth. It tells us of the long reach needed to bring granite hundreds of miles down the length of the Nile. And it tells us of a deep and genuine religious devotion, for this was above all a sacred building, raised for the holy rituals of the king's passage into the life beyond that his people believed in. A king who built like this was no enemy of the temples, and no ruler of a broken and impoverished land. The Valley Temple is, all by itself, a standing rebuttal of the legend, written out in granite and in alabaster. There is, too, the story of how the Great Pyramid itself was at last opened, in our own age, and of what was found waiting within it. For thousands of years, Khafre's pyramid had stood sealed and silent, its entrance lost and hidden. And then, in the year 1818, a most unusual man, an Italian of enormous size and strength named Giovanni Belzoni, who had once earned his living as a strongman upon the stages of Europe, forced his way inside. He climbed down through the passages to the burial chamber deep within, almost certainly the first living soul to stand in that place in thousands of years. And there he found the great sarcophagus of granite. Its heavy lid was broken, and it stood entirely empty. We have already seen tonight what that emptiness truly means, and, just as importantly, what it does not. It is not, as the legend would so love to have it, the mark of a king so bitterly hated that his very body was hidden away, or destroyed by a mob. It is the plain, ordinary mark of the tomb robber, who broke his way into this pyramid, as into very nearly every other royal tomb in all of Egypt, hunting for its gold, in some long ago century of disorder and collapse. Belzoni found an empty coffer simply because thieves had emptied it, ages upon ages before him. The bare physical fact of the empty tomb, so often pressed into the service of the dark legend, points, when we examine it honestly and without drama, only to the sad and universal history of plunder, and not in the least to the hatred of a people. And there is one strange and telling artifact from Giza that shows us in perfect miniature the very process by which legends about the deep past take their shape. It is a slab of inscribed stone, discovered near the Sphinx, which scholars have come to call the inventory stela. It appears upon its face to speak of the Sphinx and of certain temples, as already standing there in the time of Khufu, before ever Khafre came to the throne, a claim that has greatly delighted those who wish to make the Sphinx far more ancient than the mainstream of scholarship will allow. But the scholars who have studied that stone most closely regard it as a late text, one carved many centuries after Khafre had died, in an age that was itself already looking back across a vast and hazy gulf of time, and reworking the old traditions freely for its own purposes. It is not a reliable record of the deep past at all. It is, rather, a perfect small example of how even the Egyptians themselves, once they were far enough removed in time, could garble and embroider and quietly reshape their own history. And that is exactly the process, written small upon a single stone, that also produced the great legend of the tyrant kings, written large across 2,000 years of telling. And finally, the sheer confidence in the long reach of the state that Khafre actually ruled left its own physical traces behind it, scattered far and wide beyond the plateau of Giza. In the far deserts of Nubia, at that remote quarry from which the dark stone of his statues was cut. The marks of the Old Kingdom labor survive to this day in the rock. In the harsh mountains of the Sinai, Egyptian expeditions sent out after turquoise and copper left their own carved records upon the stone of that wilderness. And the name of Khafre himself has been found in scattered and distant places, small quiet signatures of a royal reach that extended out across deserts and mountains and seas. These are not, by any stretch, the traces of a kingdom collapsing inward beneath the crushing weight of its own cruelty and misery. They are the traces of a confident and a capable and a far-reaching state, one able to plan and to provision great journeys of many weeks across the very emptiest of lands, and to bring their hard-won treasures safely home again. And every single one of those scattered marks is itself one more small and silent witness, testifying against the legend of a land in ruins. For that is the very last truth of the evidence, and it is one that ought to fill us with a quiet excitement, rather than with any frustration at all, how very much of it still lies buried and unknown beneath our feet. Only a small fraction of ancient Egypt has ever yet been recovered from the earth. Beneath the sand and beneath the modern towns and beneath the green and living fields, there lie untold tombs and temples and records, the vast majority of which no modern eye has ever once looked upon. Khafre's own story is still, even now, being slowly written, corrected, and deepened and enriched by each new discovery that the ground gives up. We do not, and perhaps we never shall, possess the very last word upon him, but we have enough now, more than enough, to say with real and settled confidence that the tyrant of the old legend simply never was. And so, having tried the legend carefully against the evidence, and found it wanting on every count, we come at last to the quietest part of our long night together, to ask what all of it truly means, what it means that a good king could be slandered for 4,000 years, and what it means at the very last to give him back his own true face. Let us turn gently toward that. So what, in the end, does it all mean, this long night's strange work of putting a 4,000-year-old king on trial and then setting him free? Let us sit with it quietly now, and let the meaning settle over us as it will. The first and the strangest thing is simply this, that a lie can outlive a man by 4,000 years. Khafre died, and his body was lost, and his voice fell silent more than 4,000 years ago. And yet a false story about him, the story that he was a cruel and a godless tyrant, went on living and traveling and growing all through those long centuries, long after everything true about him had been utterly forgotten. The man himself vanished, the slander endured. There is something genuinely haunting in that, and something deeply humbling. It tells us how terribly fragile the truth about a single human life really is, and how strong and how durable a good story can be, even a false one. The truth about Khafre very nearly died with him. The lie very nearly became immortal, and it is worth asking why this should be so, why a false and cruel story should travel so much more easily through time than the quiet truth ever does. Perhaps it is because a good story asks so very little of us, while the truth asks so much. A legend is simple and vivid and satisfying. It needs no evidence at all, only a willing ear to receive it. It slips easily from mouth to mouth, gathering fresh color as it goes. The truth, by contrast, is slow and complicated and endlessly demanding. It must be dug for and measured and weighed, and it very rarely arranges itself into so neat and satisfying a shape as a legend does. And so, in the long contest between the vivid lie and the patient truth, the lie holds every advantage of speed, while the truth holds only the single advantage that matters in the very end, that it is real, and that it can therefore be found again by anyone who is willing to look for it. For 2,000 years the lie ran on far ahead, but the truth was still there, all the while waiting quietly in the ground, and it could not be outrun forever. For the truth did not die, and that is the second, and the far more hopeful, meaning of our long night. Across all those centuries the evidence lay waiting, silent and patient, hidden in the earth. The town of the workers lay buried beneath the sand. The diary of Merer lay hidden away in the rock beside the sea. The bones and the tombs and the statues and the stones, all of it lay waiting to be asked. And then, in our own age, the patient work of a great many people, digging and measuring and reading and thinking, slowly drew that truth back up into the light and set it down beside the ancient legend, and let the world at last see clearly which of the two was real. Think carefully about what that actually means. A man slandered for 4,000 years, given back his own true face by the patient labor of strangers who lived 4,000 years after him, who never knew him, and who worked only for the pure love of the truth. This is not science fiction. This is what genuinely happened, in our own time, upon that plateau in Egypt. The real recovery of a buried truth, across the very deepest gulf of time, is a more astonishing thing by far than any tale that a storyteller could ever invent. And it came to pass not through any magic, but through patience and care and the simple, stubborn refusal to accept an old legend without first asking the ground itself what it had to say. There is a kind of justice in this, and it is well worth pausing upon, for it is a strange and a rather beautiful kind of justice. Khafre could not defend himself. He had been dead for 4,000 years. He could not rise up and say, "I did not enslave them. I fed them, and I housed them, and I healed them when they were hurt. I did not close the temples of my people. I built them, and I filled them with my own image, and I endowed them for centuries." He was utterly silent and utterly defenseless against the slander of all the ages. And yet, in the end, he was defended. He was defended by the evidence, and by the people who so patiently uncovered it, thousands of years after he could no longer speak a single word in his own behalf. Let that sink in. A man was given justice across 4,000 years by strangers who owed him nothing at all, simply because they cared enough to seek out the truth. We do not often think of history as a kind of justice, but it is, or at the very least it can be, to recover the truth about the dead and to clear the falsely accused even long ages after they are gone is a quiet and a real and a profound form of justice, reaching back across the very deepest darkness of time. And Khafre, in the end, received it. And this points us, at last, toward the deepest and the most personal meaning of all, one that reaches straight up out of the ancient past and touches our own living lives. For the process that slowly made a monster out of Khafre is not a thing that happens only to ancient and long-dead kings. It happens in smaller and quieter ways all the time to all of us. We flatten the people around us, and the people of our own age, into simple heroes and simple villains. We believe the vivid and dramatic story, and we pass it on, without ever pausing to ask whether it is actually true. We read the surface of a person, their deeds, their reputation, the monuments they leave behind, and we imagine that we therefore know their heart. And we too, in our turn, can be slandered or misunderstood or quietly reduced to a false story that outlives the truth of us. And so the tale of Khafre asks something of us, gently, across the centuries. It asks us to be a little slower to believe the very worst of one another. It asks us to be slower to judge and quicker to ask what the evidence truly shows. It asks us to remember that behind every reputation there stands a real and a complicated and an irreplaceable human being whom the story can never quite capture whole. And it asks us to extend to one another, here, in the present, that very same patient fairness that the diggers of Giza reached back to extend to a king 4,000 years gone. There is one more thing worth holding tightly onto, as the old legend falls away at last. The real Khafre, the one that the patient evidence gives back to us, is not in the least a lesser figure than the tyrant of the tale. He is a far, far greater one. For the tyrant of the legend is a small and a tired and a terribly familiar thing, a cruel king driving his slaves beneath the whip, of a kind that the world has seen 1,000 weary times over. But the real Khafre is something altogether rarer and finer. He is a ruler who gathered up the free strength of a whole confident nation, and fed and housed and tended the workers who served him, and honored the deepest beliefs of his people, and raised, out of all that ordered and willing effort, some of the most perfect and enduring things that human hands have ever made anywhere on earth. And that is a far greater story than the legend ever was, and not a smaller one. To clear away the myth of the tyrant is not, in the end, to diminish Khafre at all. It is to give him back his true and his greater stature, and to give his people back the credit for the truly astonishing thing that they actually did, freely and together, in the very dawn of the world. There is a quiet and a rather lovely reversal buried within all of this, one that is well worth pausing over. For at the very end of our long inquiry, we find that we have come to know the ordinary workers of Giza, in some real ways, better than we know the mighty king that they served. Of Khafre the man, of his heart and his temper and his private thoughts, we still know almost nothing at all. He remains to the last a serene and a distant mystery. But of his workers, we know a surprising amount. We know that they ate beef and bread and drank their thick beer. We know that their bones were broken by the labor and then carefully and lovingly mended. We know the proud and joking and boastful names that they gave to their gangs. We know that they were buried with real care, close beside the great work of their own hands. The evidence, when at last it truly spoke most clearly not of the king high at the summit, but of the countless ordinary people down at the base. And there is a kind of justice in that as well, a quiet, democratic justice 4,500 years old. The pyramids were built to make one single man immortal, but it is the humble and the nameless and the many who have, in the end, stepped most vividly of all back into the light. And this gently changes, too, what the pyramids themselves come to mean for us. For if they were not raised at all by the cruelty of a tyrant, but rather by the ordered and the willing and the astonishingly skilled effort of a whole free people, then they are not monuments to oppression, and they never were. They are monuments instead to something far finer and far more hopeful, to what human beings are able to achieve together when they gather up their strength and point it patiently, across many long years, toward a single shared and soaring purpose. The Great Pyramid and the Pyramid of Khafre standing close beside it are among the very greatest things that our species has ever made. And the true story of how they were made is not, after all, a story of misery in the whip, but a story of cooperation and skill and organization, and a confidence so deep and so sure that it could raise whole mountains of stone into the sky. Seen rightly in the clear, cool light of the evidence, the pyramids are not an accusation against humanity at all. They are a quiet and an enduring testament to it. We should hold all of this, though, with a certain becoming humility, for the story of Khafre is, above everything else, a lesson in how very easily and how very badly we can be wrong about the past, and in how provisional even our finest knowledge must always remain. For 2,000 years, the whole world was perfectly confident, and the whole world was perfectly wrong. And though we now stand upon far firmer ground than that, ground built of hard evidence rather than of old and comfortable tales, we should always remember that the ground of knowledge is itself still shifting, a little, beneath our feet. New discoveries will surely come. Some of what we believe so firmly tonight will one day be refined or corrected or deepened in the years that lie ahead. And that is not a weakness in the search for truth. It is the very heart of its strength, that it holds its conclusions firmly, but never so tightly that it cannot open its hand again the moment that the evidence requires it. Khafre teaches us to trust the evidence, and to distrust the easy legend, and, always and forever, to keep on asking the patient ground what more it might still have to say. And there is, at the very last, something genuinely moving in the whole strange endeavor, something that reaches out far beyond the single figure of Khafre altogether. For to care about the truth of a man dead for 4,000 years, to labor in the sand and in the dusty archives, simply to clear his long-forgotten name, to want, purely and simply, to know what really happened so very long ago, to people whom we can never meet, is one of the gentlest and one of the most generous of all the things that human beings do. It serves no practical purpose at all. It rights no pressing present wrong. It is done purely for the love of the truth itself, and out of a kind of deep fellow feeling that reaches clear across the great abyss of time, from the living to the long, long dead. In recovering the real Khafre, the people of our own age gave a quiet gift to a man who could never once thank them for it. And in return he gave a gift back to us, the gift of a truer past and of a deeper understanding of our own selves. Across 4,500 years, the living and the dead reached out, quietly, in the dark, and touched hands. And that, perhaps, is the very deepest meaning of all. And so the many threads of our long night at last draw gently together. The calm stone face that never once matched the cruel legend laid upon it. The grave accusation, heard out in full, and then cross-examined, patiently, charge by charge, and found wanting on every count. The workers who were fed and healed and honored, and not driven and discarded. The temples that Khafre built, rather than closed. The golden age of confidence and plenty, rather than the invented century of misery. The long, sad road by which a confident king was slowly turned into a monster in the memory of the whole world. And the patient evidence that, in the very end, quietly gave him back his own true face. All of it, one single journey leading from a slander 4,000 years old to a truth recovered in our own time. That is the whole story of the tyrant who never was. And it is, in the end, a story not only about one ancient Egyptian king, but about the nature of truth itself, and of memory, and about the quiet and patient and unglamorous work of finding out what really and truly happened. And now, as the night grows deep and still around you, it only remains to let it all settle softly, and to carry you gently down into your rest. So let us close gently where we now stand with the verdict quietly delivered and the old slander laid to rest at long last. For 4,000 years the world remembered Khafre as a tyrant, and tonight, patiently and piece by careful piece, we have seen that it was simply not so. He was not the monster of the legend. He was a builder and a patron, and the confident ruler of one of the true golden ages of the world. His workers were fed and housed and healed and honored. His temples stood open, and he filled them with his own sacred image. His age was one of plenty and of peace and of astonishing and enduring art. That is who he truly was. That is what the evidence, gathered so patiently across 2 whole centuries, has shown us beyond reasonable doubt. And it is a truer story, and a kinder one, and a far greater one, than the tale the world believed for so very long. Let the whole journey of our long night move through your mind now, slowly and softly, one last time, and then let it come gently to rest. We began with a slander 4,000 years old, and a calm stone face that did not match it. We heard the terrible accusation, in all of its dark and dramatic detail, the closed temples, the enslaved nation, the whole invented century of misery. And then, one by one, we called our witnesses for the defense. The lost town beneath the sand, with its bread and its beer and its bakeries, the mended bones of the cared-for workers, the proud names they carved upon the stones, the ancient diary of a working man who was truly there, the perfect statues and the open temples, and the strange telling absence of every mark that a real tyranny would surely have left. And charge by charge, the legend quietly fell, until the tyrant had dissolved away entirely, and only the real king was left standing there in the light. That was the work of our night. And it is done now, and you may safely let it go. Let the pieces of it drift slowly past you now, one soft image at a time, like small boats moving down a dark and quiet river. The workers of Giza, sitting down together at the end of a long day to good bread and thick beer and roasted meat, fed like the valued men that they truly were. The gentle healer, setting a broken arm, and the bone knitting slowly whole again. The gang of laborers, laughing among themselves, carving their proud and boastful name into the face of a great block of stone. The official mirror, bent over his logbook beside the sea, writing down the small ordinary business of his day, 4,500 years ago. The calm diorite king, lifted up out of the dark of his temple, and back into the light. The great pyramid itself, rising, course by patient course, upon the gathered strength of a whole free and willing nation. Let these gentle pictures rise, and soften and fade, each one a little dimmer than the one before, until they blur softly together into the warm and formless dark. And remember, as you drift down at last towards sleep, the quiet and the beautiful truth that we found together tonight. A man who could not speak a single word for himself, dead and silent for 4,000 years, was defended at the very end, and given back his own true face, by strangers who cared only for what was real, and who owed him nothing at all. The lie ran on ahead for 2,000 years. But the truth was waiting, patient, in the ground, and in the end it could not be outrun. There is a deep and quiet comfort in that, if only you let it settle over you. The truth is patient, the truth endures. And however long a false story may run ahead, the real thing waits, quietly in the dark, to be found once again by anyone at all who is willing to look for it. Let that comfort carry you, softly down. And now let your mind rise gently and drift out over the plateau as it lies tonight. The great pyramids, standing dark and calm against a sky scattered thick with stars. The Sphinx below them, patient in the pale light of the moon, its worn face turned as ever toward the east. The desert lying cool and silent all around, the sand pale beneath the starlight, the long dark ribbon of the Nile far off catching the very faintest gleam. They have stood here, all of them, through every single night for 4,500 years, through the fall of kingdoms and the slow rise of others, through the coming and the going of 100 generations of human beings, and through the whole long life of a slander and its quiet undoing. And they are standing here still, tonight, calm and enormous, and at peace while you lie here in the warm dark, drifting slowly and softly down toward sleep. Let your breathing slow now, all on its own. There is no need at all to force it. Just let each breath come a little softer than the one before, a little slower, a little deeper, like gentle waves reaching a quiet shore and sliding back again. With every breath, let a little more of the day loosen and soften and fall away. Let your shoulders grow heavy. Let your hands grow still. There is nowhere at all that you need to be. There is nothing at all that you need to do. There is nothing left now to weigh, or to judge, or to prove. The trial is over. The truth is told. And all that remains at the last is rest. Feel now how the warmth settles over you, and how heavy and how calm your whole body has slowly become. Let that heaviness spread, slowly and gently, from the crown of your head, down through your shoulders and your arms and your hands, down through your chest and your legs, all the way to your feet, until every part of you is soft and warm and perfectly still. There is nothing holding you now. There is nothing left to carry. The long story is finished, and you may set it down at last, and let it rest quietly beside you in the dark. and simply be at ease. Out there, far beyond the window, and beyond the sleeping city, and beyond the long dark reach of the desert, the great stones are standing in the starlight, exactly as they have stood for 4,500 years. The pyramids, calm and vast against the deep of the night, the Sphinx patient and still, keeping its long quiet watch over the sleeping sands. They ask nothing at all of you. They simply stand and endure, calm and enormous and at peace, while the slow stars wheel overhead. And you can rest now within that same great peace, held gently by it, the way the plateau itself is held by the darkness, and the darkness in turn by the slowly turning sky. And if a last few pictures should rise, softly in your quiet mind, let them be gentle ones, the warm gold of lamplight upon the wall of a painted tomb, the calm and level face of the king, at rest in the dark, at rest for 4,500 years, the workers of Giza, fed and content and easy at the end of their long day. The wide, dark river, moving slowly and forever toward the sea. Let each one rise and glow softly for a moment, and then fade gently away into the warm dark, dimmer and dimmer and dimmer, until there is nothing left at all but the dark itself, and your own slow and easy breathing and rest. Everything is well now. There is nothing left undone, and nothing left to fear. The king rests, at long last, in his truth. The great stones rest beneath their ancient stars. And you rest here, in the warm and the gentle dark, safe and calm and free at the very last, to let go of everything you have carried, and to drift softly and without the smallest effort, down into sleep. So let it all go now softly. Let the images blur and dim and fade. Let the ancient king rest in the truth that we have given back to him at last. And let yourself rest here, in the warm and gentle dark. The plateau is quiet. The night is deep. The Sphinx gazes east toward a dawn that always, always comes, though it is still far off, and there is no need at all to wait for it. There is only the dark and the warmth and the slow, soft tide of your own quiet breathing, carrying you down and down and down into rest. The great stones will keep their long watch, as they always have and as they always will. And you can let them. You can let go now, and sink and rest. There is nowhere at all that you have to be tomorrow that cannot quietly wait for the morning. There is nothing that you must solve, or settle, or decide tonight. The whole of the long night is yours, and it is quiet, and it is safe, and it asks nothing of you at all, nothing but that you rest and let yourself be carried. So let your mind grow slow and soft and dim, like a small lamp burning gently and steadily down toward its rest. Let the thoughts come to you more and more slowly, and let them matter less and less, until at last they drift quietly apart, and loosen and dissolve, into the warm and formless dark, and are gone. And far away, upon that ancient and moonlit plateau, the great Sphinx keeps its long and patient watch, exactly as it has kept it through every single night for 45 centuries, gazing steadily east across the dark and silent sands, toward a dawn that will surely come again, in its own slow and certain time, whether or not a single soul remains awake to wait for it. And you do not need to wait for it, you need only now to rest. So let the great and ancient calm of that old and patient place settle down over you at the last, and gather you in, and hold you close, and carry you gently down and down, into the deep, and the still and the quiet water of sleep. Rest now and be at peace. The story is told and it will keep. The truth is safe and it will keep. And the calm stone face of a king who lived 4,500 years ago, and who was never the monster that the world so long believed him to be, will still be there, gazing quietly out at a world he could never once have imagined, long, long after you have drifted away into sleep. He is safe now, in the truth that we have given back to him at the last, and he needs nothing more from us, and neither do you need anything more from the night. You are safe here, in the warm and the quiet dark, with nothing left at all to do, and nothing left to prove, and nowhere at all that you need to be. All of it can wait. All of it will keep. There is nothing more to do tonight, and nowhere more to go. Only to close your eyes and let the desert grow still, and let the pyramids fade softly into the dark behind them, and let yourself sink gently into the deep and quiet water of sleep. Sleep well.